The 25 most shocking facts about Roman emperors. Close your eyes and imagine standing in the heart of ancient Rome, where the marble gleams under the Mediterranean sun and the air hums with the whispers of power. For nearly 5 centuries, this eternal city was ruled by men who held the fate of millions in their hands. Some were philosophers, some were warriors, and some were monsters who defied every boundary of sanity and decency. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the emperors of Rome. Our story begins not with the first emperor, but with a truth that echoes through every reign that followed. When we think of Roman emperors, we imagine them dying peacefully in their beds, surrounded by grieving subjects. But here's the first shocking reality. Fewer than a quarter of all Roman emperors died of natural causes. The throne of Rome was the most dangerous seat in the ancient world. Of the roughly 70 emperors who ruled from Augustus to the fall of the Western Empire, only about 15 died peacefully. The rest were assassinated, executed, killed in battle, or forced to take their own lives. To wear the purple was to paint a target on your back, and every emperor knew it from the moment the crown touched their head. This culture of violence began earlier than you might think. Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 CE, wasn't just eccentric or cruel in the ways history sometimes portrays. He took the concept of divine emperorship to its logical, terrifying extreme. Caligula didn't just want to be worshipped as a god after his death, as was customary. He demanded to be worshipped as a living deity during his reign. He would dress up as various gods, particularly Jupiter, and built a bridge between his palace and the temple of Jupiter so he could visit his brother. But the truly shocking part comes in what he did to the traditional Roman religion itself. Caligula planned to place a statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem, the holiest site in Judaism, knowing it would spark a massive revolt. He wanted to assert his divinity over every religion in the empire, even those that explicitly forbade such worship. Only his assassination prevented this catastrophic act, which would have ignited rebellion across the eastern provinces. Speaking of Caligula's death, his assassination reveals our third shocking truth, and it's one that strips away any romance we might have about Roman honor. When the Praetorian Guard, the elite bodyguard sworn to protect the emperor, murdered Caligula in 41 CE, they didn't stop with him. They killed his wife by smashing her head against a wall, and they murdered his infant daughter by bashing her against a wall as well. The same men who were meant to be the ultimate symbol of loyalty became the kingmakers and kingbreakers of Rome. Over the centuries that followed, the Praetorian Guard would auction off the imperial throne to the highest bidder, assassinate emperors they found inconvenient, and prop up puppet rulers who served their interests. The very institution designed to protect the emperor became the greatest threat to imperial power. Now, let's drift forward in time to a man whose name has become synonymous with wisdom and virtue. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 CE. We know him from his meditations, his Stoic philosophy, his reputation as one of the 5 good emperors. But here's what history often glosses over. Marcus Aurelius broke the single most important precedent that had kept Rome stable for nearly a century. Every emperor from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius had been adopted, chosen for their merit and capability. They didn't pass power to their biological sons because they understood that bloodline was no guarantee of competence. But Marcus Aurelius, despite all his philosophy and wisdom about the nature of power and virtue, chose his biological son Commodus as his heir. And Commodus would become one of the most deranged emperors in Roman history, believing himself to be Hercules reincarnated, fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum, and bringing the empire to the brink of collapse. The philosopher-emperor's greatest failure wasn't intellectual, it was emotional. He couldn't see past his love for his son to do what was right for Rome. This brings us to Commodus himself, and our 5th shocking revelation about imperial excess. We know that Commodus fought in the gladiatorial arena, which was already scandalous enough for an emperor. But the reality was even more twisted than you might imagine. Commodus didn't fight fair fights. He would fight disabled people and wounded soldiers who couldn't possibly defend themselves. He would kill exotic animals that had been tied down or otherwise restrained. The Senate and the people of Rome were forced to watch their emperor, the most powerful man in the world, pretending to be brave while slaughtering the helpless. And after each victory, he would demand enormous payments from the imperial treasury for his appearances, draining Rome's wealth to fund his delusions. He even renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, as if the eternal city existed only as an extension of his ego. Let's move now to Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 CE, and who represents perhaps the most shocking case of how young and unfit some emperors truly were. Elagabalus became emperor at just 14 years old, but age wasn't the most shocking aspect of his reign. This teenage emperor tried to revolutionize Roman religion by replacing Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with Elagabal, a Syrian sun god whose worship involved practices Romans found deeply disturbing. Elagabalus married and divorced 5 times in just 4 years, and according to ancient sources, he offered vast sums of money to any physician who could perform what we would today call gender confirmation surgery. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or exaggerated by hostile historians, they reveal something profound. Here was an emperor so young, so disconnected from Roman tradition, and so willing to overturn centuries of custom that the very foundations of Roman identity seemed under threat. The 14-year-old had more power than anyone else in the known world, and absolutely no idea what to do with it. Our 7th shocking fact takes us to the crisis of the 3rd century, a period that nearly destroyed Rome entirely. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had at least 26 legitimate emperors, and countless others who claimed the purple in various provinces. That's an average reign of less than 2 years. But what's truly shocking isn't just the instability, it's how the empire physically fragmented. At one point, there were 3 separate Roman empires existing simultaneously. The Gallic Empire controlled Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania. The Palmyrene Empire controlled Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And the legitimate Roman Empire controlled what was left. 4 years, Rome wasn't one empire but 3, each claiming to be the true continuation of Augustus's legacy. The empire that had once seemed eternal and unbreakable had shattered like dropped pottery, held together only by the idea of Rome itself. This brings us to Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 CE and who did something no emperor had ever done before, our 8th shocking revelation. After 20 years of ruling and successfully reforming the empire, Diocletian voluntarily retired. He simply walked away from absolute power, something so unprecedented that many couldn't believe it was happening. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. He didn't just retire, he convinced his co-emperor Maximian to retire at the same time, ensuring a peaceful transition of power in a system that usually only ended in blood. Diocletian spent his final years growing cabbages in his palace garden in Split, and when he was later begged to return to power as the empire descended into chaos once again, he allegedly replied that if they could see the cabbages he was growing, they would never ask him to give up such peace. The most powerful man in the world found more satisfaction in gardening than in ruling, and he's the only Roman emperor who can claim he died peacefully after choosing when to let go. Constantine the Great, who ruled from 306 to 337 CE, changed the course of world history by converting to Christianity and making it the favored religion of the empire. But our 9th shocking truth reveals a dark paradox at the heart of his reign. This man who promoted the religion of forgiveness, mercy, and redemption also murdered members of his own family. Constantine executed his own son, Crispus, in 326 CE, possibly because of accusations brought by Constantine's second wife, Fausta. Shortly afterward, He also executed Fausta herself, allegedly by having her boiled alive in an overheated bath. The details remain murky, lost to the propaganda of the time, but what's undeniable is this: the emperor who made Christianity the religion of Rome, who called himself the equal of the apostles, saw no contradiction between Christian mercy and dynastic murder. Power, it seemed, could corrupt even conversion itself. Our 10th shocking fact brings us to the very concept of what made someone Roman. By the 3rd century CE, it had become increasingly common for emperors to come from the provinces rather than Rome itself, but the trend reached its logical conclusion in ways that would have horrified the Romans of the Republic. Emperor Philip the Arab, who ruled from 244 to 249 CE, was exactly what his name suggests, an Arab from what is now Syria. Emperor Macrinus, who ruled briefly in 217 CE, was from Mauritania in North Africa, and some sources suggest he had Berber ancestry. Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who ruled from 235 to 238 CE, was from Thrace and was described by Roman sources as a barbarian, possibly of Gothic origin. The empire that had once been ruled exclusively by Roman aristocrats was now being led by men from every corner of the known world, men whose ancestors might have fought against Rome. The empire hadn't just expanded geographically, it had transformed the very meaning of what it meant to be Roman, until the word described not a bloodline but an idea that could belong to anyone. As we move deeper into the lives of these emperors, we discover that the line between civilization and barbarism was far thinner than we might imagine. Let's turn now to Emperor Caracalla, who ruled from 198 to 217 CE, and uncover our 11th shocking truth about imperial paranoia and fratricide. Caracalla began his reign as co-emperor with his younger brother Geta, but their rivalry was so intense, so filled with mutual hatred, that the palace itself had to be divided in half to keep them apart. Their mother, Julia Domna, tried desperately to reconcile them, and finally arranged a meeting in her private apartments where she hoped to broker peace. But Caracalla had other plans. In his mother's presence, he ordered his guards to murder Geta. Ancient sources claim that Geta died in their mother's arms, his blood staining her clothes, while Caracalla watched. But the horror didn't end there. Caracalla then ordered the execution of approximately 20,000 of Geta's supporters, including friends, servants, and even people who had merely expressed sympathy for him. He had Geta's name erased from every monument, every inscription, every coin. It wasn't enough to kill his brother. Caracalla tried to erase him from history itself, as if Geta had never existed at all. This practice of erasing someone from history, known as damnatio memoriae, leads us to our 12th shocking revelation about how emperors controlled not just the present but the past. After an emperor fell from power, the Senate could decree damnatio memoriae, condemning their memory. Teams of workers would travel across the empire, chiseling names off monuments, melting down coins, destroying statues, and rewriting inscriptions. But what's truly shocking is how common this became. Dozens of emperors suffered this fate, their faces literally hammered off of public sculptures, their achievements attributed to their successors. Imagine having unlimited power, commanding the greatest empire on earth, and knowing that the moment you fall, every trace of your existence will be methodically destroyed. Your face will be ground to dust, your name will become a curse, and future generations will know you only as a void, a gap in the historical record. The Romans didn't just kill their emperors, they tried to murder their very existence. Our 13th shocking fact takes us to Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, and reveals something far stranger than his supposed fiddling while Rome burned. Nero had a slave named Sporus who apparently resembled his late wife Poppaea, who had died, possibly from Nero kicking her while she was pregnant. Nero had Sporus castrated and then married him in a formal ceremony, complete with a bridal veil and dowry. But Nero went further still. He ordered everyone in the court to treat Sporus exactly as they would have treated an empress, calling Sporus by Poppaea's name. After Nero's death, Sporus became entangled with 3 successive short-lived emperors during the year of the 4 emperors. The shocking part isn't just the relationship itself, but what it reveals about Nero's grip on reality. He couldn't distinguish between his dead wife and a person he'd forced into her role, and the entire imperial court had to participate in this delusion, pretending that nothing was unusual about the emperor's new wife. This brings us to our 14th revelation, one that strikes at the heart of imperial succession and dynasty. Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, is often portrayed as a stammering, limping scholar who accidentally became emperor. But Claudius was almost certainly murdered by his own wife, Agrippina the Younger, who wanted her son Nero to take the throne. Ancient sources claim she fed him poisoned mushrooms, his favorite food. Think about what this means. Agrippina killed her husband, the Emperor of Rome, to elevate her teenage son to supreme power. And it worked. Nero became emperor at 16, making him one of the youngest emperors in Roman history, placed on the throne by his mother's ambition and her willingness to commit murder. For the first few years, Agrippina essentially ruled through her son, until Nero eventually had her murdered too, trying multiple elaborate methods before finally succeeding. The cycle of family murder, of parents killing children and children killing parents, wasn't an aberration in imperial Rome. It was a feature of how power transferred from one generation to the next. Let's journey now to our 15th shocking truth, one that reveals the sheer scale of imperial building projects and their human cost. When Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, conquered Dacia, modern-day Romania, he celebrated with games that lasted 123 days. During these games, 10,000 gladiators fought, and 11,000 animals were killed. But those numbers, as staggering as they are, don't capture the full picture. To build his forum in Rome, Trajan had workers cut away an entire hillside. The column of Trajan that stands in that forum is 125 feet tall, and it represents exactly how much earth had to be removed to create the space. Millions of cubic feet of rock and soil, carved away by thousands of workers, many of them slaves, laboring for years to satisfy one emperor's vision of grandeur. The column still stands today, its spiral relief depicting Trajan's Dacian campaigns, and every time you see it, you're looking at a monument that measures the absence of a mountain, the ghost of a landscape that was simply erased to make room for imperial glory. Our 16th shocking fact concerns Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE, and who is remembered as one of Rome's greatest emperors, a philosopher, architect, and patron of the arts. But Hadrian's love for a young man named Antinous reveals something profound about imperial power and grief. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CE, Hadrian's reaction was unprecedented. He founded a city named Antinopolis at the spot where Antinous died. He declared Antinous a god and established a cult with priests, temples, and festivals across the empire. He commissioned thousands of statues of Antinous, more than exist of any other figure from the ancient world except Augustus and Hadrian himself. Think about what this means. One person, because of their proximity to power, because an emperor loved them, was elevated to divinity. Temples were built, priests appointed, prayers offered, and sacrifices made, all because of one man's grief. If Antinous had been born into a different family, known different people, his death would have been a private tragedy. Instead, because he was loved by an emperor, his image would outlast the empire itself. This leads us to our 17th revelation about the shocking age at which some emperors took power, and how youth and inexperience could combine with absolute authority to create catastrophe. We've already discussed Elagabalus, who became emperor at 14, but he wasn't alone. Gordian III became emperor at just 13 years old in 238 CE. The boy emperor was dominated by his advisors, particularly his mother and the Praetorian prefect. He ruled for 6 years before dying under mysterious circumstances during a campaign in Persia, possibly murdered by his own prefect who wanted the throne. But imagine being 13 years old and suddenly being told you're the most powerful person in the world. You can't legally drive a car in most modern countries at that age. Yet in Rome, you could command legions, order executions, and determine the fate of millions. The Romans had no concept of being too young to rule. They only cared about legitimacy and power, which meant that children were regularly thrust into situations that would challenge even the wisest adults. Our 18th shocking truth takes us back to Augustus, the first emperor who ruled from 27 BCE to 14 CE, the man who transformed Rome from a republic to an empire. We think of Augustus as the measured, dignified founder of imperial Rome, the one who brought peace after decades of civil war. But here's what history often glosses over. Before he became Augustus, when he was still Octavian, he was part of the second triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus. Together, they created prescription lists, death sentences for their political enemies. These weren't trial-based convictions. They were simply lists of names of people who were now legal to kill. Their property would be confiscated, their families left destitute, and anyone could murder them with impunity and claim a reward. Hundreds of Roman senators and equestrians were killed this way, including the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were cut off and displayed in the Roman Forum. The founder of imperial peace built his power on systematic political murder, and the Pax Romana, the famous Roman peace, was erected on a foundation of blood. Let's move now to our 19th revelation, one that shows how paranoia could consume even successful emperors. Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE, became so afraid of assassination that he had the walls of the colonnades where he took his daily walks covered in reflective stone so he could see anyone approaching from behind. He trusted no one, saw conspiracies everywhere, and executed senators on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The shocking part is that he wasn't wrong to be paranoid. There really was a conspiracy. In 96 CE, he was assassinated in his bedroom by members of his own household staff, possibly with the knowledge of his own wife, Domitia Longina. The steward Stephanus, who had been accused of embezzling and was facing punishment, stabbed Domitian repeatedly while other conspirators rushed in to finish the job. The emperor, who saw threats everywhere, who turned his palace into a prison of mirrors, was ultimately killed by the servants closest to him. His paranoia was both a madness and a prophecy, a self-fulfilling vision of betrayal. Our 20th shocking fact brings us full circle to the nature of imperial power itself and what it meant to be worshipped as a god. After emperors died, the Senate could vote to deify them, to make them officially gods of the Roman state. But here's the disturbing truth. This divine status was entirely political. Bad emperors weren't deified. Their memories were condemned. Good emperors became gods not because of any spiritual truth, but because it served the political interests of their successors. The priests who served in the imperial cult didn't believe these emperors were truly gods in any meaningful sense. They were maintaining a political fiction that helped hold the empire together. Yet millions of people across the empire offered sacrifices to these deified emperors, prayed to them, built temples in their honor. Religion and politics had merged so completely that they became indistinguishable, and the line between a human being and a god became a matter not of theology or truth, but of a Senate vote. The emperors of Rome weren't just political leaders or military commanders. They were human beings who were transformed into gods through the machinery of state power, and that transformation tells us more about the nature of that power than any monument or inscription ever could. As we approach the end of our journey through the most shocking truths about Rome's emperors, we turn to stories that reveal just how fragile civilization can be when concentrated in the hands of one person. Our 21st shocking fact concerns Emperor Valerian, who ruled from 253 to 260 CE, and whose fate was unlike any other Roman emperor before or after. Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur during a military campaign, becoming the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign power. But his captivity wasn't a brief diplomatic incident. It was a prolonged humiliation that would horrify the Roman world. According to some accounts, Shapur used Valerian as a human footstool, literally stepping on the emperor's back whenever he mounted his horse. When Valerian finally died in captivity, the Persians reportedly skinned his body, stuffed the skin with straw, dyed it red, and displayed it in a temple as a permanent trophy. The Emperor of Rome, who commanded legions and ruled millions, ended his life as a stepping stone and then as a stuffed decoration in an enemy temple. No triumph, no funeral, no deification, just the ultimate symbol of how completely power could be reversed. This leads us to our 22nd revelation about the sheer cost of imperial incompetence and how a single emperor's failure could reshape the entire world. Emperor Honorius ruled the Western Roman Empire from 395 to 423 CE, during some of its darkest hours. In 410 CE, Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome, the first time the Eternal City had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. But here's what makes Honorius's response so shocking. According to the historian Procopius, when Honorius was informed that Roma had perished, he was initially distressed because he thought his favorite chicken, which he had named Roma, had died. Only after clarification did he understand that the capital city itself had been sacked. Whether this story is literally true or a later embellishment meant to showcase his incompetence, it captures something profound about the twilight of Rome. The emperors who had once commanded the known world had become so disconnected from reality, so isolated in their courts, that they couldn't even comprehend the magnitude of disasters unfolding around them. Rome wasn't conquered by superior force alone. It was betrayed by the inadequacy of its own leadership. Our 23rd shocking fact takes us back to the beginning of the imperial system and reveals a truth that Augustus, for all his political genius, could never quite solve. Augustus had no biological sons, and his attempt to secure succession consumed his entire reign. He married his daughter Julia to his trusted general Agrippa, hoping their sons would be his heirs. When Agrippa died, Augustus forced his stepson Tiberius to divorce his beloved wife and marry Julia instead, a marriage both partners despised. Augustus's first two chosen heirs, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, both died young under mysterious circumstances. His other possible heir, Agrippa Postumus, was executed shortly after Augustus's death. The shocking truth is this: Augustus spent 40 years trying to secure a peaceful succession, arranged and rearranged marriages and adoptions, manipulated his entire family like pieces on a board, and what he ended up with was Tiberius, a man who hated being emperor and who would spend the last decade of his reign in self-imposed exile on Capri, a bitter, paranoid recluse. The man who solved the problem of Rome's civil wars, who created a system that would last for centuries, could never solve the problem of his own family. All his power couldn't make people love each other, couldn't prevent deaths, and couldn't guarantee that the right person would inherit what he'd built. Let's turn now to our 24th revelation, one that speaks to the absolute corruption that absolute power can create. Emperor Commodus, whom we've already discussed, didn't just fight in the arena for sport. He charged the Roman treasury 250,000 denarii per appearance, an astronomical sum. To put this in perspective, a Roman soldier earned approximately 1,200 denarii per year. Commodus was paying himself the equivalent of 200 years of a soldier's salary for each appearance in the arena. But it gets worse. He would also appear dressed as Hercules and demand worship as the god reborn. He renamed all the months of the year after his own titles and names. September became Hercules, October became Invictus, and so on. He was planning to rename Rome itself as Colonia Commodiana and lead a march through the city dressed as a gladiator on New Year's Day. The state treasury was being drained to fund one man's megalomania, and the entire apparatus of government existed only to service his delusions. Finally, a conspiracy formed, and on the last day of 192 CE, Commodus was strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner Narcissus. The man who believed himself to be Hercules died naked and defenseless, killed by an athlete he trusted. Our final shocking truth, the 25th, brings us to perhaps the most fundamental question about the emperors of Rome. What does absolute power do to a human mind? Throughout this journey, we've seen emperors who murdered their families, who demanded worship as gods, who became paranoid to the point of madness, who built monuments from the bones of mountains, who fought disabled people in arenas, who tried to erase languages and religions, and who ultimately consumed themselves and everyone around them in their hunger for control. But here's the most shocking revelation of all. These weren't aliens or monsters. They were people, born as vulnerable infants, who laughed and cried and loved and feared just like anyone else. The difference was the throne. That seat of power, that purple cloth, that laurel crown, it changed them. Some resisted it and retired to grow cabbages. Some were corrupted by it and became beasts. Most fell somewhere in between, trying to be good emperors while the weight of absolute authority slowly crushed their humanity. The throne of Rome wasn't just a seat of power. It was a machine that transformed human beings into something else entirely, something that could order the deaths of thousands with a gesture, something that could believe itself divine, something that could look at the suffering of millions and see only the reflection of its own glory. And so we end where we began, standing in the heart of ancient Rome, where the marble still gleams and the echoes of power still whisper through the ruins. The emperors are gone, their monuments crumbling, their names half forgotten or half remembered. But the lessons they teach us about power, corruption, humanity, and the thin line between civilization and chaos, those lessons remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The throne of Rome taught us what happens when one person holds too much power for too long, and that lesson, perhaps, is the most shocking truth of all.